Hey Refuge Church, it's good to be back with you guys again. We are finishing up chapter 13 of the book of Shemot, our Exodus. The people of Israel are about to take off from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, and in this part of the story they even do. We're there, we're moving. So let's walk through this passage together. I will pray. God, I thank you for the story and for the reminders that we can find in it and directions to help us understand you and ourselves better. I pray that you'd be with me teaching, that I might be attended by your Spirit to say things that are true and helpful and good and illuminating, and be with those listening, that they would be able to hear what it is that you would like them to hear, that they would have focus, that they would move forward from this time of listening or watching and have a sense of what you're doing in their life, maybe for the rest of this week. Ask you for these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right. So at the end of chapter 13, we've moved past these commandments, right, about the firstborn, talked about all of that, and now we are looking at their leaving. So jumping in, when Pharaoh sent the people, God did not lead them by the path of the land of the Plishtim, the Philistines, the Plishtim. Quote, "For in drawing near to it, said God, in leading them in the seeing of the battlegrounds, they will return to Mitzrayim." Okay, so that whole time they've been using the word sent rather than let go in the English, because it's mirroring that conversation about Pharaoh's daughter sending out her hand, if you remember that. So Pharaoh has done the right thing. He has mirrored his daughter. He has let them go. He has sent them out. And now God says, I don't want to send them through this enemy territory, this Plishtim territory, because it's, even though it's much faster than going this long way, because they might see battlegrounds, or they would see battlegrounds, a place of battle, and it would cause them to want to return. So first, Plishtim, we've probably, if you've grown up in the church, just known that the Philistines are like the bad guys, and that's about it. But why are they called the Philistines? The root behind Philistine or Plishtim is pilash, which comes from the picture of rolling from one place to another. And so it's the word that we get sojourner from. So historically, in the archaeological records, these people were known as the sea people, because they were refugees, warring bands of refugees, but still refugees from the islands of Greece. There was likely a famine, and so everyone just got on boats and took off and entered into Turkey and entered into Egypt and entered into this section of the Levant, this part of the coast of the Mediterranean, and they dominated militarily wherever they went. And so here we see they've kind of camped out in what is now Gaza Strip. Actually, it's that area. And they're just known as the sojourners because they're not from the area, the people who rolled into town. What's interesting about that is, if you're familiar with the story of Torah, the first 5 books, God is constantly talking to the people of Israel, telling them that because they were once slaves, because they were once aliens, because they were once foreigners, therefore they ought to be blessing and treating well and loving and doing justice for the sojourners. And we missed that when we edited out into just Philistines. But it could be that one of the main themes of the whole section of the Bible in which they show up a lot is that these are the people that the people of Israel are supposed to be loving, are supposed to be blessing, and instead they're always at war with them. So just keep that in mind. Where are the people around us that we feel like are our enemies, feel like always a thorn in our side? Maybe they're the people all along that God intended us to bless. Okay, so in all of this, we can also observe that God is a master of human psychology, right? He makes this plan of where he's going to take us, the people here, lovingly, full of understanding. He understands human emotions. He knows what's going to happen if he takes his brand new people out into a place where they will be afraid. And so that's good news. God cares about how we feel about things and plans accordingly. And I think that that's probably missing from some of our definitions of godliness. You know, what does it mean to look like God? We should probably add in there seeking to understand human emotion, be sensitive to it, and alter our behavior based on how people feel, right? That's part of what it is to act like God, to look like God. And so we should try to do the same with ourselves and with others. One of the other things that we can kind of play with here is that they would have been able to get to the land, this open, wide open space that they've been dreaming about ever since they heard that it was there waiting for them, or ever since they have been speaking about it. Tradition kept through their time of slavery. There's this land that is ours that we get to go back to. They could have been there so much faster if they did not have this internal struggle with fear, you know, and I'm not going to judge them for being afraid. If you get to a battleground and see the remnants of war, I would probably feel the same way. So not talking down to them there. However, sometimes our dreams or the things that we're working on are seasons of our life, whether it's a season of singleness or it's a season of a difficult time at work, or a season of trying to get into university or trying to get through university. Any of those, for instance, they can feel like they're taking so long. And one thing, maybe it has to take a long time. Maybe that's the way it is. But maybe there's a lesson that we could learn that would expedite the process, right? If the people had been able to have more trust, then they would have been able to walk through those battlegrounds and say, you know what, I know that God's taken me this far. I know he's going to take me the rest of the way. It's going to be all right. If they had been able to do that, they might not have ended up wandering around for 40 years, right? So for us, see if you can ask yourself, ask God, look at the season around you and say, what is the lesson that I'm supposed to be learning during this time? Am I causing myself more suffering than I need to because I'm ignoring a lesson that maybe I could be learning? Can be helpful. And all of this, God taking them the long way around, is because he says at the end of the verse there, that if they see the battlegrounds, they will want to return, not even want to, they will return to Egypt. That can be a little bit baffling. Like, how could this people possibly want to return to this place where they were enslaved for generations? Surely, a battle or two is better than being enslaved and genocide, right? But I think there's something to learned helplessness that can happen. We can get comfortable with the suffering that we're in right now and say, I don't know about the suffering in the future, so I'd rather stay here, right? There's that famous psychological experiment before the Board of Ethics got put in place in the States anyway for scientific research, and that famously they electroshocked a bunch of dogs and while the dogs were in the cages, and then they opened the cages and kept shocking the dogs, and the dogs didn't run away. That's kind of similar here, right? They see one bad thing and think, you know what, I'm okay with the bad thing from before. And that's a theme that we'll see for the rest. And it obviously wasn't. Their children were being killed. But sometimes we can lose track when we're not grounded and rooted in trust in where God is taking us, that we can end up going back to bad relationships. We can end up going back to old ways of behavior, ways of thinking. All sorts of things can come to mind of things that we can return to rather than trusting and moving forward. So that's something else that we can work on, making sure that we can have goggles of trust that even if there is pain in the future, right, because there's no future in which pain doesn't exist, that we will be able to move through it, and therefore we don't have to return to the badness, whatever it is, the darkness that we've just found freedom from. All right, next verse. It says, God turned the people. That word is like hinged. So they were going out this way and he hinged them back a different way on the path of the desert of the Suf Sea, the sons of Israel ready for battle from the land of Mitzrayim, Egypt. So that's an extra piece of irony there, right? God knows our emotions often better than we have really grappled with them. So the people of Israel, it says, God knows that if they actually came upon a battle scene, they would freak out and want to run away. But not being in tune with their emotions, they're like, yeah, we're ready. They're ready for battle. Some people translate that like they're in a battle formation, they're well armed. There's different ways to take that, but ready for battle. Okay, so he turns them on the path of the desert. We've talked about the desert already. The word for desert is midbar. It's the place, it's the M at the beginning, the place of speaking. So God loves to take people into desert places, especially if they haven't been listening, because in the solitude, in the heat, in the dirt and grime and exhaustion of the desert, for some reason, that is a place that we're really able to hear God speaking to us in the silence and desolation of the desert. So if you don't like the desert, if you like to be comfortable, if you like to have water easily on hand and enjoy oases more, one way that you can avoid the desert is making sure that you can hear God's voice and that you're paying attention to where God is leading you in your life already. It's kind of that same principle of if you don't learn how to rest, your body is going to make you rest, right? If you overwork and you're not taking any time for yourself, your body will eventually break down, and make sure that you rest, and it won't be as fun as taking a good Sabbath day off. Same idea. If we're not listening to God, we might find ourselves in a desert where we can't hear him. And then the Suf Sea, we're just taking these verses, these topics one at a time, walking through them. The Suf Sea, a lot of dispute about that. Suf probably means either seaweed or reeds. We know that because it's what Moshe's box is hidden in when he gets deposited in the river by his mother. And so, but there's a lot of conversation and consternation kind of coming from the right in the center a little bit, wanting to say it wasn't the Red Sea, it was just a lake that had a bunch of reeds in it. Here's the thing, the Red Sea also has a bunch of seaweed in it, so it doesn't really make that much of a difference. It's just an Egyptian word anyway, and so we don't have as good of a grip on those that vocabulary, or at least I don't, and the resources I read don't. And so they were at a sea which had a bunch of plants in it. We'll just go with that. But there is a word for lake, and it's not the word for lake, so that's important if you care about the conversation that goes on about how much of the Exodus really happened. It says sea. Okay, the sons of Yisrael ready for battle from the land of Mitzrayim. Next verse. Moshe, this is fun stuff, took the bones of Joseph, there's no J in Hebrew, it's almost always a Y, Joseph with him, for the sons of Yisrael had sworn an oath. This is what the oath was. Certainly God will visit you. You must take up his bones from here. So that's the oath that's been passed down. An oath, the word for oath is just the word for seven. So in the biblical world, if you say something 7 times, it's an oath, which is something you might keep in mind if you repeat over and over and over, oh man, I really hate this person. You've said it 7 times, that's an oath. Just kind of play around with that idea or not, if you're not interested. But anyway, so they've sworn this oath to themselves. Certainly we know that God is going to come for us. And when he does, we've got to take Joseph's bones with us. So the story is, how on earth would Moshe know where Yosef's bones would be kept. He was a high-ranking official, nearly one of the highest ranking in Pharaoh's court, right? If you don't know the story of Yosef, he's one of their ancestors. He's the first one to come to Egypt, and he climbed up the ranks successfully and gained all this power and resources. And so where would they have kept his body, right? Where would they know how to find it? And so the Midrash answers this question for us. Midrash being the exegetical strategy of the Jewish people on how to grapple with this text is storytelling. And so they tell a story to answer this. And it's also an answer to a different piece. So in Genesis 46 or 47, there's a woman named Serach. And Serach is the adopted daughter of one of the sons of Yaakov, Asher. It lists Asher and then all of his sons, and then it says, comma, and their sister, Serach. So it doesn't say daughter of Asher. That's why they say adopted. That's super unusual, especially in that passage, because that passage is setting the 70. It's listing the 70 people who came to Mitzrayim. That 70 is really important because that'll become the basis of the chiefs and elders later. That 70 is going to be the basis of the Sanhedrin later, the 70 elders, the 70 old ones. And so we don't know how biblical they were being, but if they were being biblical, they should have had at least one woman in the Sanhedrin and at least one woman in the chiefs later in the book of Numbers. But anyway, so Serach is there. And the problem that the Midrash is grappling with in the text is it says she walked into Egypt with everybody. And then later it says, and it still says daughter of Asher or sister of the sons of Asher, she crosses through Moab into the land of Israel when they enter the promised land. And so how could someone still be alive after all of those generations of slavery, come out, take the walk, live through the 40 years in the desert, make it there, cross over, and still be alive? So they have transformed Serach into this really delightful semi-mythical figure who's, depending on which midrash you're reading, she's semi-immortal. In one story, she shows up to help Samuel, all the way later in the Iron Age. But my favorite midrash is that rather than dying, she snuck out and found the Garden of Eden and is still living there along with Enoch and a couple other people who evaded death. So all these stories, by the way, are found in the Talmud, Tractate Sota, and in Genesis Rabbah, which is a big compilation of old midrash. All right, so what's the deal with Serach in this story? So Moshe, in the night, everybody else is looting. Everybody, basically, not really looting because they're asking. Everyone's going to their neighbors and asking for their valuables, basically, it says, and asking for cloaks for their children, etc. And out into the night goes Moshe, and he knows that the people have sworn an oath, maybe Aaron or Miriam told him, that he needs to find the bones of Yosef. And so he's asking around, who knows where the bones of Yosef have been put? Who knows? Where are they? Is he going to need to do a heist to try to find them? What's the deal? And he is told the old woman Serach knows because she was alive, right? And so he goes and he finds her, and she does know. Wonderful. And she leads him to the shores, to the banks of the Nile, and says that he has been buried in a metal coffin at the bottom of the Nile because the Egyptians were hoping that Yosef, who protected them from famine, would bless their people through the Nile with fertility and abundance and all of those things. And so Moshe, which gives you a fun insight into his character, has this problem now. Bottom of the Nile, which is a big river. It's not a creek. There's a metal coffin. What's he supposed to do? So he starts just yelling at the coffin. He says, "Look, Yosef, you're the one who made us promise to take your bones out. I'm not going to swim down there and get it. So if you want your bones to go back to the land, you better solve this problem on your own, buddy. And so the coffin floats up from boop, 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 from the bottom of the Nile. Moshe says, great, grabs the bones and goes. So usually, or almost always, the Midrash has a deeper meaning there. Probably, I'd guess that one has to do with, rather than looking for financial resources, you can experience miracles when you hold true to tradition and oaths and such. But also, listen to the old women in your life. Might be a fun takeaway from that. But it's just a bit of a side story. We haven't done a Midrash journey in a bit. So there you go. That's the character of Sarach. She shows up a few other times in the text. Thought it would be delightful to introduce y'all to her. All right, so here they are. They're going out. Moshe, maybe a little bit still wet from, dragging the coffin out of the Nile. And it says that God went before their faces. By day in a pillar of cloud he led them, at night in a pillar of fire to light for them, that they could walk day and night. So there's a whole bunch of conversation about whether the pillar is really two pillars or just one pillar, because we want God to be one and not two, and this whole thing. That's not as important to me. If you're into that, I would probably posit that there's two, because it doesn't say that it turns into a pillar of fire. And that seems like it's just code for worrying about a trinity or not in Jewish tradition and Christian tradition. But what's important is whenever we are talking about the desert and we're looking at the desert as a motif, the desert is a symbol. It's also a real place, but it's a symbol for the times in our life, for the seasons in our life in which we feel exhausted, lonely, lost, full of despair, right? You don't see stories in which people just go out into the desert for funsies, unless it's Jesus going to get solitude to pray, listening, right? The place of speaking. It all comes together. But it's usually a place where people go to hide because they're on the lam, right? Elijah has to go to the desert because he's made a whole nation mad at him by calling down a famine that's killing lots of people. So he goes to the desert, gets fed by ravens. Place where Hagar, after she gets kicked out of the camp very unjustly by Sarah, she hears the voice of God there, but she thinks that she's going to die, right? She places her son under a bush, and God shows up and speaks to her. All sorts of things like that happen in the desert. Places of community would be back in the city. Places where you're with other people would be at the camp. Places when you're in the desert, you're almost always alone and confused and exhausted. So if you recently or currently or a while back are in a season of a desert, first, you can listen for the voice of God, because every time in the Bible that somebody's out there, God shows up for them. And second, keeping your eyes peeled on the horizon for where that pillar of fire or pillar of cloud is leading us. Because what can happen sometimes is we get out there in the desert and, just like Moshe, stretch our limbs out and we're like, yeah, this is really hard not to have community and to be lost deconstructing, for instance, on my own. But you know what? It's better than out there where everybody's going along with the same thing that I don't understand anymore, or I think is wrong or hurt me in some way. And so we make our hut in the middle of the desert and we don't look for God, and we just say, this is who I am now. I'm going to be like John the Baptist, right? I'm just going to chill out by myself, which of course he wasn't, because he had throngs of followers following him. But we're saying, this is who I am. I am a person who knows about uncertainty. I'm a person who can grapple with not knowing everything, and that's noble of me, right? That can be true. It takes a great deal of courage to leave the city. And so if you have been able to leave an abusive church situation, kol hakavod, in Hebrew, all glory, to you. That's not facetious. I really mean it that way. That's wonderful to leave abusive spaces. That's a good thing. However, we don't want to stay in a place that is not life-giving and make that who we are, right? That's not full wholeness. That's not full flourishing, to languish away from a source of living water or regular water. We want to keep our eyes peeled for where God is still leading us, because God has not given up on us. Even if we've given up on that community, right? Those are two totally separate things, which we'll talk more about in a sec. But God is still working with us, even if it's harder for us to ascertain without the help of our community, always speaking within us, right? And so if we can keep our eyes peeled, where's the pillar? God wants to move us forward. He doesn't want to leave us to die out in the desert, just like Simba and Timon and Pumbaa. Maybe God will show up like Timon and Pumbaa for you. Maybe he'll show up in a pillar of fire, or maybe he'll show up just with a whisper of a suggestion of where you might be going next. But keep your eyes peeled, because he's out there. He is not going to leave you to die. All right, the last verse here. And the pillar of cloud did not depart by day, and the pillar of fire did not depart by night. I love that repetition, just in case someone out there was wondering, like, well, maybe it left at nighttime. It's like, no, did not depart in the day, and it did not depart in the night from before the faces of the people. I love that extra part, because there's someone out there who's like, yeah, but maybe if you're like at the back of the train, it's a really long train, and so sometimes you're just not like able to see God's face or the presence of God, and that's fine. It's because the people at the front can't. No, God cares about equality and everybody having access to him, right? What is the gospel in the New Testament? Jesus comes and says, the kingdom of God is at hand. That's what the good news is. It's at hand to everyone. It's accessible to everyone. And so here we also see God's presence as leadership is before the face of every person, and doesn't like speak in to everyone, like Hakol would say it in a different way. It's every person. Their faces do not depart from before each person's face, however that worked physically. And what's even more heavy in that is that it uses a certain word for did not depart. Could have said did not exit, could have been other words, but it says mush. Lo mush, it did not depart. Mush, of course, being related to whose name but Moshe. And Moshe, up until this point and continuing onward, I would argue, has not been the best leader in the world, right? He can't really be blamed for what was done with him as a baby, but when genocide is going on, what happens? He departs. He goes off and gets the best privileged treatment in the palace, as far as we know anyway. Right when the people needed him most, and it was his chance to use his privilege for the liberation of his people, he takes off for the desert. Nope, not interested. I'm worried about me. Bye. And so there's this emphasis made that leaders, including church leaders, including this church leader, but leaders from your past, leaders in your future, will fail because they're human. They will depart when you need them. That is just what happens, and it is painful, and it doesn't need to happen, and not every leader is devastating to their flock in some way. And so maybe you haven't had that experience, but if you have, know that that is a reflection of that leader, like Moshe. It is not a reflection of God, and God puts that in there twice. I do not depart by day, and I do not depart by night. I never leave you nor forsake you. Even if a mother were to forget her own child, even then I will not forget you, for I have engraven you on the palm of my hand. Right? Book of Isaiah. So when we're grappling with, I don't know if I trust God anymore, I don't know how I feel about a relationship with God, what that even means, when all of these people who claim to be operating under the name of God behave so terribly and devastatingly, and they betray, and they do all of these things, it is super hard not to conflate those two. And I understand that, or I think I understand that confusion that happens when someone who we've looked up to so much does something. How can that not be a reflection on who God is? And yet, God shows up and he says, Moshe does that, I'm not Moshe. I don't leave you. So hopefully we can let that resonate. We can let that permeate our souls and bless us and be able to receive that, because it's one thing to be able to check the box. Yeah, I got it. Sure, he's never going to give up on me. Awesome. It's another thing to let it soak in, to receive it. So I am going to pray that all of us are able to do that, able to really make it a part of our being and understand in a deep experiential way who God really is and how he's different than all of the garbage that we've experienced in the past, potentially. Maybe you've had a wonderful experience. You've never been in a desert, and this whole sermon is just like, oh, okay. I'm so happy for you if that is the case. Wonderful human being that you are. I don't mean that facetiously. I really am happy for you. Okay, so let's pray. God, I first ask that you would help us have our eyes open to who the sojourner, the outsider, the aliens are around us, who we might see as the enemy, and have our eyes opened to the fact that this might be the very person that from the very beginning you've wanted us to bless. Help us figure out ways that we can bless them. I pray for all of us who are still hurting in our deserts, grappling with betrayal, bitterness, resentment, trauma, pain, grief, all of the things that might have happened to us in our disparate communities, that you would show up in that space, and that when you do, our eyes would be open and our ears would be open to see it happening, to understand that's what's going on. I ask that you would help us to trust that when we see it and not just write it off as, just a bright moment in the day and then return to our norm of barely scraping by in the desert. You give us people like Yitro, and you give Moshe people like Yitro. His name means abundance, inviting us to abundance, inviting us back to community and celebration in community. So I ask that we would have the faith, have the trust to leave the place that we are in, even if it's suffering that we know and we're comfortable with, and be able to trust you going forward to something else, a different pain, but hopefully a lesser pain, Lord. Be able to trust you that the place that you're leading is good and that we'll be okay, and that we don't need to define ourselves by this desert. I ask for that. I finally ask that you would help us truly know, yada know, experientially know, relationally know that you are a God who doesn't leave us, that you don't betray us, that you are different than the church, you're different than that pastor, you're different than that small group leader. You are separate. That's what holy means, right? You are set apart, you're different, including from other Christians. Help us heal in that space, help us heal, leaning on you and turning to you as the one who doesn't fail us. I ask for all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. Whew. Heavy, maybe not, maybe exciting, maybe not that interesting. All of the above, good. Whatever your response is, we'd love to hear it. 7:30 p.m. on Zoom. If you are not in the Pullman area, if you are in the Pullman or even Spokane area, we would love to see you. We're going to start in-person meetings in June. Check out the website for that information, but never fear, people who are not in the area. We're going to keep everything exactly the same for you guys. We're still going to load the sermons for you guys. I'm still going to lead groups for you guys. So if you haven't joined in until now, you can still join in. If you've been listening along and waiting for a chance to show up, now's your chance. June, how exciting. And then if we've been able to bless you in any way, please feel free to give or tithe at our website or in the link in the description. We would really love that. You're helping get us on our feet. Certain people getting a living wage is what we're working for here. If you're wondering where that money's going, that's where it's going. And yeah, link with a PDF description as well, and that has the translation in it and questions if you want to contemplate them before discussion. All right, much love to you guys. I'll see you next week. Have a good one.